evening, colleagues. Thank you for coming. Well, I assume that if you have come here today, you are interested in logic and logical fallacies. I can say that I personally am an enthusiast, and I hope that by the end of this workshop, you will become as enthusiastic about it as I am. So we are talking about argumentation here, and let's start. Yeah, this is the outline. This is the structure of our workshop today. First, we'll mention the argument structure. Then we'll talk about what logical fallacy is. And the bigger part of our workshop will be focused on discussing different types of logical fallacies and strategies to avoid them. And I hope we'll have plenty of practice. Of course, we understand that argument is at the core of any, at the core of academic discourse. And when we write academic texts and prepare academic speeches, we build our argumentation. There are many different classifications and many different structures. Actually, there are many ways to call it. I here present probably the simplest structure of an argument, which is premise and conclusion. We can also call them evidence and claim. This is just the difference in terminology. Yeah, and our argument is actually as strong as our premises are, and as sound as the connection between premises and conclusion is. And this is what a good argument consists of. And to begin with, I would like to show you an example of a good argument. This is actually an abstract of a published research paper. Please have a look. What do you think? What elements of an argument can we see here? What elements do you identify here? I can see here at least two pieces of evidence. I can see at least, in my opinion, at least two pieces of quite sound and valid evidence. Of course, it's only an abstract, so the author is going to provide all the detailed evidence in the paper. But already in the abstract, we can see clear reasoning and clear explanation and justification of his claim. So, for example, this is the first, this is evidence one. And this is evidence two, that not only animal testing is can be unreliable, it can even be potentially harmful. And this is the conclusion that the author makes. I would also like to pay attention to the wording, because this is an example of a very good text where the wording, the form aligns with the content, and the author doesn't use so many linking devices, for example, but the author uses them effectively to align with the content and to make his argument even stronger. What specific language can you see here that makes this, that adds to the strength, to the validity of this argument? Additionally, I show. So this is evidence number one, this is evidence number two. So additionally, I show. And finally, hedging techniques as well. Yeah, because the resulting evidence suggests that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So this is an example of a good argument, and this is what we should all strive for. Unfortunately, today we are mostly going to deal with something less strong, and I decided to start with this example of a good and sound argument to make a comparison between what we are going to see later today and to see why it's not as valid. So what is a logical fallacy? I'm just going to provide you with one definition. Of course, there are, again, several possible definitions, and this definition comes from one of the sources that I have been using. An error or weakness in an argument that detracts from its soundness, but is disguised so that it may look like the conclusion is supported. It may look like this. Yeah, this is what is so tricky about logical fallacies. and we'll mention it a bit later, the treacherous nature of logical fallacies. And it always lies in the false reasoning when conclusion doesn't follow from the premise. I would like to ask you, where do you usually come across logical fallacies? Mass media. In my students' essays, this is what I actually expected. This is where we all see logical in dialogues with students. Yeah. So it's our job probably to teach them and to show them, to explain it to them that it's not the right reasoning, that it's fallacious. All right, so do you ever come across logical fallacies in academic papers or in scientific discourse? Very rarely, of course, because the authors usually work on their arguments and work on their reasoning, but as they hide behind rhetorical techniques, we can sometimes overlook them even in the academic discourse. It can happen during the discussion, exactly, in oral communication, when people don't have time to think it over and to think straight, probably they can commit a fallacy. All right, so you mentioned mass media, and I have a bit of an example, and I want to show you a very, very short commercial.
Is the joy for me. I love bread. I love bread. I now just manage it, so I don't deny myself bread. I have bread every day. I have bread every day. That's the genius of this program. I lost 26 pounds and I have eaten bread every single day.
So, what do you think is being advertised here, first of all? A program for losing weight. People get impressed, like, wow, Oprah has eaten bread and has lost a lot of weight. But what is actually at the basis of this, this commercial? What assumption underlies the technique at the core of this advertisement and many others of this kind? This is called product endorsement, but at the basis of product endorsement lies a logical fallacy, because the fact that it's good enough for Oprah and she has lost 25 pounds or whatever she lost does not necessarily mean that it's good for you personally, and does not even mean that it's good for the majority of people. And it's quite common, yeah, so you can hear and see it everywhere all the time, not only in media and in comments on social networks, but even in political discourse, in political debates. If you just type in the search engine logical fallacies and political debates, you will find so many examples. And the thing is that the people who commit these logical fallacies are not so often criticized for them, and they even come across as persuasive speakers often. Rich enough to lie for the sake of advertising something that doesn't work. Yeah, exactly. So she's famous, she's rich, and it means that everything that is good for her is supposed to be good for us, which is a logical fallacy. All right, so then we come to the question, why should we avoid? Of course, if people who make logical fallacies can still pretend to be very persuasive and can still be perceived by other people as persuasive, maybe we should ask ourselves this question. But there is no even dispute about it. In academic discourse, logical fallacies are absolutely unacceptable. Why? Because they impair the communication of your ideas. If you make a logical fallacy, you can be misunderstood easily, and you can communicate something which you did not set out to communicate. They weaken your logic. If the reader or the listener is careful enough and spots your logical fallacy, your argumentation will not seem as persuasive to this reader anymore, even in the parts where it is sound and valid. Of course, it makes your whole argument less convincing and credible. All right, now now we are going to talk about just a little bit, touch upon the types of fallacies, because it's necessary. I think I have to mention it. but very briefly. Aristotle identified 13 types. The modern logicians have identified over 150 types, and the number of types keeps multiplying. And of course, we don't need to go into such detail. We'll just focus on the most common types. But what I have to mention here is that logical fallacies can be divided into formal and informal ones, and formal fallacies occur when there is a flaw in the logical structure, in the form of the argument, in the logical form of the argument. Whereas an informal logical fallacy occurs when the form is correct, so the argument is valid, may still be valid, but it's not sound, because usually because the premises are false, or premises are unrelated, to the conclusion, or sometimes even to the topic of the discussion in general. And I should say that all the fallacies that we're going to look at today are informal logical fallacies. And I would like to give you an opportunity to find faulty logic for yourself. Please open the handout and look at the first task. There are several statements, several arguments there. Please read them and try to think where the problem with logic lies. All right, so let's probably start discussing them one by one. I should say that the fallacies that we are going to look at now result from oversimplifying, from what does it mean? From ignoring important consequential circumstances of the context of the argument, and just focusing on something very, very simple, simplistic. Okay, so that was the first statement. What is wrong with it? Here they're committing a logical fallacy, which has the name of hasty generalization. When we come to a conclusion about a large group of something based on very, very small and limited evidence. So what does the author do? The author makes a broad claim based on a small or unrepresentative. Okay, there is another fault with logic. The conclusion is normative, while the premise is descriptive. And data are insufficient or statistically insignificant for such a broad claim. And here in the picture, you can see a phrase that we can all hear in our everyday life all the time, that all drivers, all sports drivers are like this, all female drivers are like that. And normally in our everyday communication, we call such statements stereotypes. And yes, at the basis of a stereotype lies hasty generalization. This is the definition of this fallacy. What to do with it? How to avoid it? What should we do not to make this fallacy? If you want to prove something like this, you need a larger, be accurate with commenting the results exactly. Be accurate, like avoid, for example, a short language, because the author of the statement says that it means that the prescriptions now, the common prescriptions are excessive. But why does it mean that? That's too definitive, too short. Okay, so how can we change that statement to make it more sound? One of the possible interpretations. Or we can continue with however to make conclusions about sleep requirements. In general, for students in general, we need to conduct a survey on a larger sample. Yeah. All right, let's have a look at the next statement. What is wrong with this statement? It's very interesting because it comes from public discourse. You can watch, I give here a link. You can watch a video on YouTube where Dr. Phil, who seems to be quite popular in the USA, says that. What is wrong? The points seem to be not connected, exactly, but what the author of the statement assumes, it's only an assumption. The cases are quite different. Automobiles and cigarettes are not contaminants, are not contagious. Dr. Phil assumes is that these reasons cause a lot of deaths, and COVID causes a lot of deaths. So they are alike, but they are not alike in this very relevant respect. And this is a fallacy that is called false analogy, when the author compares things that, despite being alike in one or more characteristics, are essentially different in the relevant respects. In the relevant respect that COVID is a contagious disease, they are not alike. That's why, hence the shutdowns. All right, so this is the definition of this fallacy. I have prepared a picture for you, which also represents a false analogy, in my opinion. And it often appeals to emotions, of course. You can see here that it's not only a type of informal fallacy, it's also a type of a persuasive technique, in which the fact that two things are alike, or two or more things are alike in one respect, or maybe two respects, leads to the invalid conclusion that they must be alike in everything else. Okay, how to deal with it? How to avoid such a fallacy? What can we do not to commit the fallacy of false analogy? Probably comparison can be valid in some cases, but when we compare, we need to make sure that for our claim, the properties that are important for our claim are really alike, not only connected, but things that are similar in a relevant characteristic. All right, so what's wrong with this statement? It's a typical post hoc ergo propter hoc. The author claims that, without proof, just claims that the growth in the divorce rate was caused by women working outside the home. How to avoid it? How can we make the statement stronger? What do we need to claim that one thing caused another? Some sort of research. The author writes that extensive research was conducted by several scientists with citations and with references to the research. Statistics, for example, exactly, at the missing part. Then the claim will assume some likeness of validity. Provide evidence when claiming causal relationships between ideas. And when you claim that it may be clear in your head that, of course, I'm sure that this thing stems from some statistics could help, absolutely. This thing stems from that thing, but just make sure and check that in your argument you give solid reasons, solid evidence that one thing really led to another. Okay, what is wrong with this statement? As there is no evidence that this will help. To present the argument makes a claim that is based on an assumption that there are only two options. But, and what is manipulative, why this is a manipulative technique, one of the options is presented as certainly undesirable, which makes the conclusions, which makes the reader believe that there is no alternative for just one step or just one option. But it is false because the options presented are neither exhaustive, like many of you have mentioned here. There must be other options to stop the recession, nor exclusive. They are not mutually exclusive. It means that if we lower interest rates, the recession may continue. As somebody has mentioned, are these two connected? Does it necessarily mean that this thing, there is no proof that it will help? This is a false dilemma or false dichotomy, where two options are presented as if they are the only ones. How to avoid it? Can we say that we have excluded all the other options, and why? We need to make sure that we are presenting all alternatives, all possible explanations and all possible alternatives. And if we rule some options out, we need to explain why we rule them out, why only this option is left to fight recession. Okay, so let's look at the next one. What is wrong with this statement? The author assumes that on every step of the way, the action inevitably leads to certain consequences. And the author claims that without any proof, no evidence is presented to prove that A will lead to B, B to C, and so on. And the more the steps there are in this slippery slope argumentation, the less reliable it is, the less reliable it becomes, and the conclusion is not adequately supported. If you remember the example of a good argument that we read at the beginning of our workshop was also about animal experimentation and animal testing. So you can compare that sound valid argument with this one, and you can see the difference. That the author, inevitable course of action, absolutely. The author of this argument presents this as an inevitable course of action, which is definitely not true because we live in the world where there is animal testing, and this terrible, the end of civilization hasn't happened yet. So this is the definition. How to avoid it? How can we avoid it, or how can we help other authors, for example, our students, not to commit this fallacy? What strategies are there? As usual, explain the connection between all the links of your chain of logic. And make sure that each link is valid, because even if one link is illogical or not supported by evidence, the argument is invalid. And of course, it's better to avoid such chains of reasoning, like this will happen, and then this will happen, and then this will happen, and finally we will come to that. And we shouldn't overestimate the likeliness of our conclusion. So we cannot claim that the final result is a certainty. Okay, there was, this is the next statement. What is wrong with it? It's a generalization. Something inherently wrong with this argument, something else has a different meaning. The word discriminate means two totally different things within this one argument. And this is called the logical fallacy of equivocation, when, as you see the picture, 2 is a number, 1 is a number, so 2 equals 1, according to this logic. Of course, there is nothing wrong with discriminating in the general meaning of seeing the difference between two things, but discrimination, when we say that discrimination is wrong, we mean something completely different. If you look at a dictionary, I have shown the screenshot from the Cambridge Dictionary here for you. We can see that this word has at least two meanings. And so how can we avoid such a fallacy? How can we make sure that we do not commit equivocation? By stating what we mean by a key term in our argument, and by making sure that the most important words for our argument are used in only one meaning throughout the argument. Otherwise, the argument does not be consistent in the meaning of the words we use exactly. All right, let's have a little bit of practice, and we're going to work in Google Doc. Identify the types of logical fallacies in the statements there, and offer your continuation of the sentences. How would you continue the sentences to make them logically sound? Let's see which versions we like the best. For example, if you don't like the first one, what was the logical fallacy in the first statement? Equivocation, that's right. And I can see some continuations. If you don't like organized political parties, then you can analyze the reasons and consider available alternatives. Then don't vote. I really like it. You have two options: organize a better party or help the existing ones improve. Also a very good option. Of course, all of your ideas make for quite a sound argument, because the continuations that you provided do not jump to conclusions, yeah, and do not state anything, and do not contain an equivocation as the original one. One, either we improve the city street lighting or we will fail to reduce crime. What is the fallacy here? False dilemma, that's right, it's a false dilemma, exactly. And in either we improve the city street lighting or we have to deal with the related issues of the contemporary urban life in some other ways, or else we'll just have to bear the consequences. Exactly. So in this continuation, you present several alternatives. We can potentially face multiple problems, such as accidents and robberies. Yes, we can potentially face them, but it doesn't mean that we will fail to reduce crime, like the author of the initial statement claims. By doing it, help the police to reduce crime level, or we will have to pay higher taxes to ensure more police in the streets. Okay, here we are also given like two alternatives. Yeah, probably there are more. So we will have to deal with more unpleasant consequences. Okay. Or we should think of other ways to make the street safer. Absolutely. Either we do this or we apply some other ways, or we look for other solutions, because it's not the only solution here, definitely. Number 3, what is the fallacy here? Someone has written A. It is hasty generalization, but also it is something else. What else is number 3? It's at the same time post hoc and the hasty generalization. It is possible that it might be caused by the negative effects of the nearby nuclear power plant. It is possible, but it's not definite. And without a great deal more medical evidence, we can't understand what caused it. Of course, absolutely. It may have been due to the influence of the plant, but again, we can't prove it without more medical evidence. One cannot prove that the proximity did not contribute to her miscarriage. However, a more robust statistical survey is necessary to establish the correlation between living near nuclear power plants and the occurrences of birth defect. I totally agree with all your continuations, and I think they're all wonderful examples of sound reasoning. The students failed to drink water. What fallacy is this? It's another post hoc. It's another post hoc. Could have been caused by a number of reasons, including dehydration. Of course, it could have been one of the reasons, but definitely not the only reason that explains the consequence. That's probably because the test was on logic and they failed to understand the difference between an implication and an equivalence. Yes, I like this one. Okay. Guns are like hammers. This is recognized by someone as false analogy. They are both tools with metal parts that could, and yet restriction necessary. The sole purpose is to kill. Yeah, by how can you make the statement more sound? By showing the difference between guns and hammers. Sole purpose is to kill, whereas hammers can be used in a peaceful way. I like this one. Guns are like hamsters. They are both visible, tangible, and beloved by some people who like to keep them at their homes. Why not? Why not compare them to hamsters? So we should probably love them and think that they're cute. Using this reasoning. Guns and hammers are both tools, but the former has been designed to kill people, while the latter, on the contrary, to help people in their work. So restrictions on purchasing guns are not ridiculous at all. Other useful functions for hunting. Okay, therefore they should not be banned. So somebody here thinks that they should not be banned because both of them are used for other useful things. Fair enough. This is identified as the last one is a case of what fallacy? About marijuana, the one about, well, actually keeping the same logic as the authors was not the point here. The point was to make it more logically sound. It could have been a different argument altogether. But I can see why you decided to keep it the same way and why you decided to make it better and how the specific feature of guns, both guns and hammers that you added, how it helped you to come to the same conclusion. Okay, so this is slippery slope, that's right. They might eventually switch to the heavier drugs, but not necessarily, of course, they might. Some of them will likely use it and some others won't, exactly. So this, and somebody else is writing still. This could be hasty generalization, could be, of course, because we say that, yeah, in all statements where we speak about everybody, people, something will happen. Anytime we talk about large groups of people or things without evidence, and every time we make this fallacy of hasty generalization. This is why such words as every, always, never should be omitted when we make an academic argument, when we make a claim. This is, as many of you probably know, this is called qualifying your claim. So you need to add some qualification. Everybody cannot, every representative of the same group cannot possibly bear the same characteristics. Okay, so let's move on. And now we're going to talk about some other fallacies which result from avoiding the real issue and appealing to something else, some other circumstances and some other facts which are not related to the argument at hand. And I would like to refer you again to the handout. Can you please look at task number 3 this time? And again, read the statements and identify where the problem with logic lies. Let's focus on the first one. Okay, what is wrong with the statement? Where is the premise and where is the conclusion? Instead of giving something new as a premise, the author just gives a paraphrase of his own conclusion. Because euthanasia is it's the same as to help another human being escape suffering through death, and morally acceptable is the same as a decent ethical thing. So it's no more than a repetition of the same thing. And this is universally known as begging the question or begging the claim. When the conclusion is presupposed, this is a more obvious case of begging the question, where the author just restates the claim, in other words, as evidence. So instead of saying something new, he just says the same thing, as Margarita has said. No real evidence is provided. So euthanasia is morally acceptable because it is morally acceptable, because I think so. Yeah, that's it. And the premise is just a paraphrase of the conclusion. Begging the question is a type of fallacious argument whose premises presuppose directly or indirectly the truth of its conclusion. In this example, it was direct. Have a look at this example here. It's another case of begging the question. And this is one, by the way, this is one of the logical fallacies that was identified by ancient Greeks. And it has existed since then. Of course, psychics predict the future, or else how could they know your destiny? Yeah, so something that is used as evidence is actually a rephrasing of the claim itself. How can we avoid it? Check that there is really the answer to the question why in your statement, and check that your statement contains evidence, because you may think that you have said something new, but in fact it is nothing new. And check if any of your premises by any chance paraphrase the conclusion. So, all right. This is the second statement that you looked at in the handout. What is wrong here? The straw man, which is not only, again, a logical fallacy, but quite a popular rhetorical technique, when instead of arguing with the essence of your opponent's point of view, you represent your opponent's point of view as something ridiculous, often something that is easy to refute, and you refute this instead of the actual point of view of your opponent. And the author attributes to opponents incorrect views that they most likely do not hold. Who says that people who oppose the capital punishment think that the lives of convicted murderers are more valuable, more important than the lives of their victims? Nobody states that. But the author of the argument just chooses to claim that, to represent the opponent's point of view in this way, to make it easier for him to refute it. The author attacks a weaker, a ridiculous position. Yes, you mean the straw man? Do you mean that the straw man in my picture is cute? Okay, I like this version of a straw man too. All the other versions that I could find were kind of scary. Although it's scary to commit a strawman fallacy, I decided against it. Okay, so the real issue, in fact, is not addressed, as Margareta said. Instead of arguing about capital punishment, we argue about something else completely. This is another example of strawman fallacy. How can we avoid this fallacy? What do we need to do to make sure that we do not commit a strawman fallacy? And if it's a debate, for example, like a political debate, if it's a conversation, or if it's possible, the best way is probably to restate your opponent's point of view and check with them. If you have such an opportunity, ask them, is that what you believe? Yeah, and only after that start arguing against it. All right, so what is wrong with the governor's answer here? And I think you can recognize politicians' answers all over the world in the governor's answer. Some claims that are not very vague. What else is he doing here? Answers too general. Does it relate that? Does it answer the question? Actually.
No.
It doesn't, and this is what actually a lot of people do all the time, and we can hear it on TV. Instead of answering the question, he changes the subject. It's related to environmental situation, to environmental pollution somehow, but he doesn't answer the question. He throws in what is known as a red herring, which is here to distract. Exactly. So the fallacy is committed here because the author brings up a completely different issue. Maybe not completely, because it's about environmental pollution, but a different issue instead of addressing the issue at hand. And it often happens when the author tries to disguise the weakness of his position. It often happens in debates. When I feel stronger here, so I'd rather talk about this. I don't want to talk about that. What you're asking me, I don't want to discuss the topic you're suggesting. I want to talk about something else completely. This is a distraction technique, which works very well, by the way, unfortunately. So, for example, you can see another example here. What's your plan to address climate change? My tax cut boosted the economy. Yeah, this is what they generally do. Okay, how to avoid it? How to make sure that there are no red herrings in our argument? Stick to the issue at hand. Yeah, do not change the subject when you, of course, not in the situation when you need to do it. Now that we know more about logical fallacies, we can apply them at our convenience, but not in academic discourse, definitely. And it's a good idea to acknowledge and address weak aspects of your argument rather than evade them. This is known as, for example, limitations in research, and you should always admit and state your limitations and turn them into your strengths instead of evading them and ignoring them, because people will, anyway, your opponents will reveal this technique. Avoid the temptation to shift the focus of discussion. Okay. So what is wrong here? What is wrong with this statement? What is not logical in this statement? What does the author of this statement thinks everybody will think and agree with him on? Yeah, Johnny Depp fans believe that everything that Johnny Depp says is true, and Amber Heard fans believe the opposite. Yeah, and this is what we have seen at the beginning of our workshop today in the commercial. This is a fallacy which is called appeal to authority, and by many logicians, an appeal to somebody else's authority and somebody else's words and opinions in general is considered to be wrong. So always when you have an opportunity to prove something for yourself, you'd better use it instead of saying this person said so. But it's especially wrong when this authority you're appealing to has absolutely nothing to do with this field. And the author refers to an expert who has no real authority in the issue. And as I have already mentioned, a lot of advertising is based on this precise technique. How to avoid it? It's very simple, and this is what we all do when we prepare our research. Make sure that the authorities you cite are experts, of course, in this field. There are actually a number of conditions that have to be aligned to make your appeal to authority strong. But the main conditions are, of course, that the authorities are experts. And it's always better to explain the reasoning or evidence. Even if you cite the authority, it's better to explain how they arrived at this conclusion instead of just quoting them and saying that they believe so and that's enough for me. So what is wrong with this statement? We don't know anything about the sample and about the survey. Appeal to something that is very important for whom? For the people. That's why it's called ad populum. It's important to the people. People say it should be so. The majority of people believe this. So it means that it's true, which is definitely not the case. Yeah, so this is appeal to something that is important to the people. The author argues that something is correct just because the majority of people believe so. Popularity is used as justification instead of evidence. So there is no evidence to prove that, to bolster the claim, but popularity is used instead. And we all know that public opinions, if you look at this picture, you will remember some of the situations when public opinions were not reliable and were not the truth. Okay, how can we avoid it? Require some proof. Of course, we need to provide evidence to justify the claim, not just somebody's opinion. It's very close to appeal to authority. In one case, we provide as justification some celebrity's opinion, the opinion of somebody who is famous, and in this case, we appeal to public opinion, but it's not enough. It's not evidence. Evidence should be provided at all times. Okay, so this logical fallacy is probably the most popular in all sources. It's mentioned everywhere in all the sources that I have studied. So what is wrong with the school board official's answer? He's attacking what or who? Person who complains, exactly. This is the classic ad hominem. Yes, so instead of proving why and providing some evidence of why his claim is not, why there is no validity to the claim, to the charge, the author of the statement attacks the personality of the opponent. And yes, this is ad hominem fallacy. How to avoid it? It's probably the simplest. I put it at the end, although it's the most popular, because I guess it's the fallacy which is very seldom committed by anyone in the academic context. I should say, at least I very much hope so. So how can we avoid it? Retain a respectful academic tone all the time and focus on the characteristics of the argument. of the counter argument. All right, so now we are going to practice some more. And can you please look at the last task in the handout, task number 4. In this task, you can see 5 arguments. Some of them are fallacious, some of them are sound. So I would like to ask you to identify the fallacious arguments, which ones are faulty. Also identify the type of fallacies and suggest changes in the arguments to make them logically sound. I have, instead of the presentation, I have shared the handout just to be able for everybody to look at the statements. So let's talk about the first one. Do you think it's sound? Do you think the first argument is sound? Very good. I can see that the majority are voting for it. And I agree with you. I think it's an example of a very good argument. What about number 2? So everybody thinks that it's not sound. What is the problem? What logical fallacy can we see here? This slippery slope. What can be done to improve this argument? The author wants to prove that casual Fridays is not a good idea. How can we do it better? Use models instead of will, good idea. We need a lot of empirical evidence. How can we claim that this will lead to that in the future? Have there been similar cases? Has there been any research into this? We cannot provide arguments. I don't agree with the author of this argument. I don't know about you, but I don't think that casual Fridays can somehow undermine the work ethics of culture. Let people be casual, yeah. All right, so shall we move on to the next one? What do you think about number 3? Is it valid, is it sound or not? But this is absolutely appeal to authority. False analogy, so we extrapolate one characteristic of Pope Francis that we know about to all his claims and arguments and opinions. Could be, but in the first place, of course, it's an appeal to authority. How can we solve this problem? What can be done to bolster the claim in this case? It's not like, yeah, we are representatives of women, but it's not like we are going to be pontiffs or go into priesthood. This is a kind of evaluative language that we should try to avoid. Yeah, of course, we appeal to his personal characteristics. Okay, so what can we say about number 4? What do you think about number 4? So most of you believe that it is a valid sound argument. Can you please give your reasons why you think it's sound? It might be subjective. Of course, as any argument, it might be subjective, yeah. Such situations demand better management, yeah, because there is some qualifying here, yeah? He doesn't say always it's the issue of better management of pain. He says such situations demand better management of pain. So this is what also, we can see it in the language. This is what also makes this claim stronger. All right, very well. What about the 5th one? Not sound. The verdict is not sound. You think it's a straw man? Could be. What else is quite obvious here? Look at the data, look at the numbers. False dilemma is inherently here as well too. It's inside this argument. So the only way to solve this problem is to open a new parking lot. Yes, and that's a false dilemma. I agree with this. But what is, if we look at the numbers? 2 of 10. Yeah, Daria, thank you. The data, and Margarita says the data aren't representative. They looked at only 2 parking lots out of 10 in the city or in the town. These numbers sound very strange for Moscow dwellers. We have 10 only in one district probably, but still. Do you think opening, by the way, so we have established this argument as not sound. The data aren't sufficient, Maria, I agree with you. And the new parking lots may actually motivate people to buy more cars. Absolutely, this is how it works in urban planning and urban development. False dilemma is here too, yeah, and also hasty generalization. I would like to bring you to the next and to the final actually point that I want to make today about fallacy. So if we think that just because an argument is fallacious, then its conclusion is necessarily false. It's a logical fallacy in itself, which is called the fallacy. So even with the fallacious argument, the conclusion might still be correct by chance, probably, yeah. So we need to be very careful with that. So if we see fallacies in our opponent's arguments, it doesn't necessarily mean that he's completely wrong. And we need to keep an open mind. And when evaluating, when assessing other people's arguments, it's a good idea to apply the so-called principle of charity. Yeah, which says that you should not attribute logical fallacies or irrationality to people's argument when there is another plausible alternative, when it can be explained by something else and not a logical. Maybe you misunderstood the author. Maybe there is some data you don't know about. So sticking to the principle of charity is a good idea. So we have come to an end of our workshop today. I would like just to share my ideas of how to make arguments more logically sound in general. Of course, we need to make sure that there is enough evidence. Of course, this is what we have seen in all the faulty arguments today. Of course, we need to make sure that we have explained the direct connection between the evidence and the conclusion. It is the cause of many fallacies. We should consider all possible explanations and alternatives. This is a way to avoid several fallacies as well. We should look out for ambiguity and make sure the keywords we use are not ambiguous and that we use them in one specific meaning all the way throughout the argument. Of course, it's always a good idea to read your own text critically, not only look for logical fallacies in other people's text, but we need to be careful and attentive to our own arguments as well. And of course, in the academic context and in all contexts in our life, we need to be respectful and represent both the opponents and their arguments respectfully and correctly. And finally, let's apply the principle of charity. Charity is such a wonderful word, not only in life, but also in logic and in argumentation.